in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, where no GPS signal can reach and no rescue team dares to venture, Captain Marcus Rivera was about to face a nightmare that would change everything he thought he knew about survival. What started as a routine cargo flight would become a terrifying battle between civilization and the most primal fears that lurk in the darkest corners of our world. It was March 15th, 2019, when Captain Rivera, a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience flying through South America's most treacherous territories, received what seemed like a straightforward assignment. His mission was to transport medical supplies from Lima, Peru, to a remote research station deep in the Brazilian Amazon. The weather reports showed clear skies, and his twin-engine Cessna 402 was in perfect condition. Everything seemed routine until the jungle decided to claim another victim. As Rivera flew over the endless green canopy that stretched to every horizon, his instruments began acting erratically. The compass spun wildly, the GPS flickered in and out of service, and strange electromagnetic interference crackled through his radio. The Amazon has always been known for its mysterious properties, but this was unlike anything he had experienced in his decades of flying. Dark clouds appeared from nowhere, swirling around his aircraft like a supernatural vortex. The storm hit with devastating fury. Lightning struck the plane's left engine, sending sparks cascading through the cockpit. Rivera fought desperately to maintain control as his aircraft plummeted toward the impenetrable jungle below. The last thing he remembered was the deafening crash of metal against ancient trees, the smell of burning fuel, and the horrifying realization that he was completely alone in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. When Rivera regained consciousness, he found himself hanging upside down in his pilot's seat, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The plane had carved a path of destruction through the jungle canopy before coming to rest against a massive cecropia tree. Miraculously, he had survived the crash with only minor injuries, but as he looked around at the twisted wreckage of his aircraft, he realized that survival was just the beginning of his ordeal. The jungle around him was alive with sounds he had never heard before. Strange calls echoed through the dense foliage, and the air was thick with humidity and the musty smell of decomposing vegetation. Rivera gathered what supplies he could from the wreckage: a partially damaged radio, some emergency rations, a machete, and a small first aid kit. His survival training kicked in as he assessed his situation. He was hundreds of miles from any known civilization with no functioning communication equipment and no one knowing his exact location. As night fell on his first day in the jungle, Rivera created a makeshift shelter using pieces of the aircraft's fuselage. The sounds of the Amazon at night were terrifying howls, screeches, and rustling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But it wasn't the wildlife that would prove to be his greatest threat. As he huddled in his shelter, trying to conserve his strength for the challenges ahead, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Smoke rising in the distance, and the faint sound of drums echoing through the darkness. The next morning, Rivera decided to investigate the source of the smoke. Perhaps it was another crashed aircraft, or maybe researchers who could help him. Armed with his machete and what little confidence he could muster, he began trekking through the dense undergrowth toward the mysterious smoke. The jungle seemed to close in around him with every step, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. After hours of difficult travel through thorny vines and muddy terrain, Rivera stumbled upon something that defied his understanding of the modern world. Hidden deep in the jungle was a village unlike anything he had ever seen. Primitive huts made from branches and leaves surrounded a central fire pit where the smoke had originated. But what made his stomach turn with horror were the bones scattered around the settlement. Human bones, picked clean and arranged in disturbing patterns. Before he could retreat, Rivera heard movement behind him. He turned to see figures emerging from the jungle, their bodies painted with strange symbols, and their eyes filled with a predatory hunger that spoke of ancient and terrible traditions. These were members of an isolated tribe that had been cut off from the outside world for centuries, preserving customs and practices that civilization had long forgotten. And among those practices was ritualistic cannibalism. The tribesmen surrounded Rivera with spears pointed at his chest, jabbering in a language he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. He was now their prisoner, and from the way they looked at him not as a person but as meat, he knew his situation had become desperate beyond imagination. They bound his hands with jungle vines and led him toward their village, where the sight that greeted him would haunt his nightmares forever. In the center of the village, suspended over a smoldering fire pit, were the remains of what had once been human beings. The smell of cooking flesh filled the air, and Rivera fought back waves of nausea as he realized he was witnessing something that belonged to humanity's darkest past. The tribe had maintained their ancestral ways, completely isolated from the modern world, and to them he was nothing more than an unexpected gift from the sky god. For 3 days, Rivera was kept in a bamboo cage, watching in horror as the tribe prepared for what he could only assume was a ritual feast in his honor. They sharpened their primitive knives, gathered strange herbs, and painted their bodies with increasingly elaborate designs. The children of the tribe would come to stare at him with curious eyes, poking at him through the bamboo bars as if he were an exotic animal in a zoo. On the 4th night, as the tribe began their ritual preparations, Rivera knew he had to act. Using a sharp piece of bamboo, he had been secretly working loose. He managed to cut through his bonds just as the ceremonial drums began to beat. The entire village was focused on the ritual fire where a large pot of water was being brought to boil. This was his only chance for escape. Rivera waited until the height of the ceremony, when all the tribesmen were dancing around the fire in a trance-like state before making his move. He squeezed through a gap in his bamboo prison and began creeping toward the edge of the village. But the jungle floor was treacherous, and as he stepped on a dry branch, the loud crack echoed through the night like a gunshot. The dancing stopped immediately. Dozens of painted faces turned toward him in the darkness, their eyes reflecting the firelight like those of wild animals. Rivera ran blindly into the jungle as spears and arrows whistled past his ears. The tribe's hunting party crashed through the undergrowth behind him, their knowledge of the terrain giving them a terrifying advantage in this deadly game of pursuit. For hours, Rivera stumbled through the darkness, branches tearing at his clothes and thorns shredding his skin. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but he knew they were still following him, tracking him with skills passed down through generations of hunters. Every shadow could hide a spear-wielding warrior, and every sound could signal his capture and certain death. As dawn broke, Rivera found himself at the edge of a fast-flowing river. Behind him, he could hear the tribe closing in, their calls growing louder and more urgent. With no other choice, he plunged into the dark water, letting the current carry him away from his pursuers. The river was treacherous, filled with hidden rocks and dangerous rapids, but it was his only hope of escape from the cannibals who had marked him for their next meal. The river carried Rivera for miles through the heart of the Amazon, past landscapes that few humans had ever seen. As he clung to a log to stay afloat, he began to see signs of the modern world, a discarded plastic bottle, the distant sound of an aircraft engine, and finally, the most beautiful sight he had ever witnessed. A research station perched on the riverbank. The researchers who pulled Rivera from the river barely recognized him as human. He was delirious from exhaustion, covered in infected wounds, and babbling about cannibals and ritual fires. It took weeks of recovery before he could tell his complete story, and even then, many dismissed his account as the hallucinations of a man driven mad by jungle fever and trauma. But Rivera knew what he had experienced was real. Deep in the Amazon, far from satellite coverage and civilization's reach, there are still tribes living as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. They follow ancient laws and customs that modern society has forgotten, and to them, outsiders are not fellow humans deserving of mercy, but rather gifts from the spirits to be consumed in sacred rituals that have been performed since the dawn of time. Today, Captain Marcus Rivera lives in Lima, Peru, and he has never flown over the Amazon again. Sometimes on quiet nights, he can still hear the drums echoing in his memory, and he knows that somewhere in that vast green wilderness, the tribe continues their ancient practices, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble into their domain. The jungle keeps its secrets well, and some stories are too terrifying for the outside world to believe. The Amazon rainforest covers over 2 million square miles, and much of it remains completely unexplored by modern civilization. Who knows what other secrets lie hidden beneath that endless canopy of green? What other tribes maintain traditions that would horrify the modern world? And how many other pilots, explorers, and adventurers have vanished without a trace, becoming nothing more than missing person reports filed away and forgotten? Rivera's story serves as a chilling reminder that despite all our modern technology and supposed mastery over nature, there are still places on this planet where the old rules apply, where survival depends not on GPS or radio communication, but on the most primitive instincts that have kept humans alive for millennia. In the heart of the Amazon, civilization is just a memory, and the jungle itself decides who lives and who becomes part of its eternal, terrifying story.